Are you right, Karen? Yeah? Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I really appreciate you all coming and having some input. And want to thank Kevin Burden and Chris Bonfield for coming all the way from England and sharing some of their information with us about the research that they've done in iPad use. So I just want to introduce a little bit of what we've done, and then Kevin will talk and for about 15-20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a bit of time for discussion about some questions you might have. Also, St Agnes is going to share some of their journey with us, and then we'll go for a bit of a visit to one of the classrooms to see what they've been doing. So take this opportunity to ask as many questions, and obviously I'll sort of document some of this later on too, and we can keep in touch, and we may have other things that we want to talk about later on. All right? So I just wanted to frame this a bit, is we did have a forum recently with a lot of our schools, and the things that came out of it is some of the things that we should be thinking about that came out of it from our forum was that we need to be considering the leadership around iPad implementation, obviously the pedagogy, so that needs to be considered importantly. Professional learning, and I know there's a lot of interesting things that's come out of your report, Kevin, so that'll be interesting. Evaluation and feedback from students, parents, teachers. We need to be sort of looking at that and making sure that we're actually getting that sort of information, and St Agnes has done something on that recently. You know, those administrative issues, you do have to sort those things out beforehand. Your infrastructure, it's very important. Make sure you've got that sorted out. Your app selection as well. So have some sort of book lists, app book lists, things like that. And how do you select them? You know, are they going to be free? Are they going to be paid? The actual rollout, so make sure that students are actually, and parents understand how the iPads are going to be rolled out. Have you got an information night? You know what sort of problems might occur that you need to think about. Some of the things I know, strategies around when they are actually implemented around class and student management. So you really need to think about that as well. And I know there's been strategies used by a lot of the schools, and St Agnes has got some too, which is good. And just the whole issue around parents, making sure that they're on board and they understand what's happening, and they've had an opportunity to ask questions. So that was the sort of things that we've come up with, and so it'll be good now to have a listen to what Kevin says from their research, what's come up from yours. So I'll leave it with you. I'll give you this remote. There we go.
Okay, is that fine? Okay, thank you very much, Lisa, and welcome. Thank you for the invite. I'm delighted to be here. Rather surprised to see so many people. It's great that you've been able to find the time to come and listen to what I have to say. I won't try to cover everything, because the report, if you had a look at that report that we've published, it's 115 pages, I think, and we just wouldn't cover that in the time we've got. So I'll try just to pull out what I think are important, pertinent points, and then I gather we're going to have a discussion and talk. And I'm here very much as well to listen to what you're doing, and from the sounds of it, some really interesting work going on here in Sydney. So if I just set the context first of all, this piece of work which I'm talking about today is a piece of research that the University of Hull, where I work, was commissioned to undertake on behalf of the Scottish Government. And in Scotland at the moment, there is a real interest, a buzz, in terms of personal ownership, and an attempt to move to a one-to-one policy, whatever that might mean, for every child. So the national government, you may be aware that there is a national government and a local government in Scotland. The national government have set an agenda to identify a framework. And that's where this research was situated, because various players, people like Apple, Toshiba, various manufacturers, have tried to demonstrate how a personal ownership scheme might work and what it might look like. And we were asked as a university to evaluate an independent evaluation of one particular scheme, which was, in this case, Apple's. And actually it was with iPads, although in some of the schools there was an exploration of other devices as well. But the predominant technology was the iPad. And the question I've got really, I guess, is as a result of what we've looked at, what kind of mobile learning activities are interesting and worthwhile? I think this is an important question because it's possible with any technology, and the iPad is just the same, it's another technology. It's possible to use it for the wrong reasons. It's very easy, in fact, just to use the technology because we've bought the technology, we think we should use it. I'm more interested in, first of all, what do we think is interesting? And secondly, what's worthwhile? And obviously they're very debatable, quite subjective terms, and I'll come back to what I think they mean as I talk. But maybe that's something we can come back to as well and discuss as a group. Because there is a danger, I'm always conscious of technology being introduced for its own sake. In the UK we had a rush to introduce interactive whiteboards about 10 years ago, and there was a point at which I think there was a tendency there just to introduce it because the school down the road had bought one, rather than thinking, what do we need it for? What pedagogical purpose would it serve in our school? So I'm drawing those questions up right at the start. The other thing which I think is important to remember when we're looking at this particular piece of research and the use of iPads generally is that there is a history that this technology falls into. It's called mobile learning, M-learning, and it's been around for at least 10 years. There's quite a literature about what happens when the technology goes with the learner rather than the learner goes to the technology. And in a sense, this is part of that tradition. And one of the things I think we see in terms of the change, one of the really important elements, is the move away from what John Traxler calls tethered learning. And much of what we've done, for historic reasons, with technology has been tethered. It's been fixed. It's often fixed in this case in terms of space, because the technology needs to be networked, it needs to be plugged into the wall, therefore the space is tethered. Obviously the learning therefore has to take place in that space. I think it's also tethered in terms of time. Because if you think about it, in a traditional setup where technology is located in one room, you have to be very careful as to how you organise time. You can't just use it when you need it. You have to actually book a place. Many teachers reported, before they used the iPads, how they would have to book a room to use technology, often 2 or 3 weeks in advance. They weren't really sure they'd need it when they got there. And then when they actually got to the room, because they booked it for an hour, for example, they felt obliged to use it for an hour, even though they might only need it for a few minutes. So it's another form of tethered. And I think as well, the other characteristic, I think, of traditional technologies, which contrast with mobile technologies, is the fact that they are depersonalized. Very few people invest much personal commitment in a networked piece of technology. I've not heard children talk about how excited they got about using a PC in a computer room. But you contrast that with what they do with their own devices, personalise their devices. They personalise the device in lots of ways. Obviously, physically they personalise the device. They personalise it in terms of the cover. They personalise it in terms of the apps. And they invest a lot of themselves into mobile technologies. So I think we are seeing something that's significantly different to traditional technology. And that's an important caveat when we're talking about what difference does this kind of technology make, how should it be used. It's highly personal, it's highly mobile, it's highly individual, or it can be. And therefore, it offers a challenge, I think, to traditional classrooms, because by their nature, classrooms are artificial. There's not very much we can do about that, but there's a high degree of artificiality in classroom learning. That's the way it's developed historically. What mobile technologies do, though, is they offer the opportunity to break away from the artificiality by creating more authentic tasks, more authentic learning environments, more situated learning, which I'll talk about in a moment. The other thing, just another example, the other thing I was thinking about when I was preparing this was, has it always been that way? And of course it hasn't. If we think back in terms of schooling, the history of schooling is relatively recent, 200 years I guess, in terms of formal mass education. It's no more than 200 years old anywhere in the world. And before that point, learning still occurred. and it occurred in a really situated way. It occurred often where it was actually happening. This is an example of children picking cranberries at the turn of the century with their parents. And there would have been a lot of learning taking place very much on the spot in the work environment. And of course, classroom learning has tended to move away from that. So mobile devices, I think, and one of the things we tried to look at in the report was they offer an opportunity to change or to break out of some of those constraints. They offer a great deal of mobility. The technology goes with the learner rather than the learner having to go to the technology. They offer opportunities, I think, for really authentic learning, which I'd like to come back to, because for me that's probably the most interesting theme from all of this. How do we make learning more authentic? And they offer opportunities for personal learning. They also offer opportunities for collaborative learning, which we'll look at. Certainly in the UK, despite all those advantages, there has been numerous concerns from parents, from schools, and just last week, I think this was quite recent, from our inspection agency, Ofsted. Ofsted are now, as you can see there, talking about banning mobile devices if they are seen to be disruptive. And disruptive can take a number of interpretations. But that's just part of a long tradition. We've had scares about wireless, another reason that they should be banned. We've had scares about bullying. And I guess these are probably similar to issues that have arisen in Australia as well. And we've had scares about bullying with regard to teachers. I'm not going to show it, but if you do a search for YouTube, you'll see numerous videos taken by youngsters posted on there about their teachers. And there has been considerable concern, understandably, about that. So the real question is, will these devices, in this case it's an iPad, but it could be any tablet device, are they really going to make a difference? Are they actually going to change those underlying structures, pedagogical patterns? And if so, under what circumstances? And that was the background really to the research we undertook in Scotland. And I'm jumping in a sense to the end, but I want to mention this because it frames what I'm trying to talk about. When we looked at all the case studies, we looked at all the various schools and tried to pull that together and make some sense, it seemed to us that there were three elements that really come out of mobile learning that schools and teachers, policymakers and school leaders need to take into consideration. The first one was personalisation, the extent to which the technology is personal to the individual and allows learning to be personalised as opposed to mass learning, which has tended to be the norm historically. The second one was collaboration and the extent to which these technologies allow students to collaborate, to share data, to share conversations, and to learn as a result of that. And the third one, which for me is the most exciting, but probably the least explored or exploited, was authenticity. And the idea there is, can we actually move towards more authentic learning contexts, where children learn, not perhaps quite as we saw in the picture there, next to their parents in the fields, but certainly more based on real-life contexts, and also real-life tasks. So that's the framework which we've developed, and I'll come back to at the end, and perhaps we can discuss that, because I gathered from what you were saying that you're interested in looking at frameworks. And in terms of research, I'll just skim over some of the background and get to the main findings. But the research was conducted across 8 schools in Scotland. And if you know Scotland, most of the population of Scotland is situated in a very small area, what's called the Central Belt, which is this area, across from Edinburgh to Glasgow. Most of the rest of the Scotland is sparsely populated. So our schools fell into that Central Belt. And they included 365 devices, one for every day of the year. There are actually more devices than that, but those were the number of devices that were used personally. And what we were looking at here was personal ownership. So there were schools who had been using technologies almost like class sets, but they didn't fall into the research. What we were really trying to focus on was what happens, what makes a difference when students have the device all the time, 24/7, including the opportunity to take it home. we actually found, although that was what we thought we were researching, that it wasn't quite the case. Most of the schools, 6 of the schools, operated that model, whereby students had the device all the time in school, all the time at home, and it was up to them when they used it. The teacher didn't interject, the teacher didn't say, go and get your iPads. They were personal. So the students carried them round all the time. They made the decision when to use it. One of the schools operated a personal in-school policy, whereby students had them all the time in the school but couldn't take them home. And one of the schools, and I'm not quite sure why this school was involved in the research, but they operated a policy I'd describe as a kind of laptop policy, whereby these were sets and they were handed in and handed out. And although it wasn't the purpose of the research to make judgments about the models, I guess in the end we did make a judgment, and our broad judgment was very much about this end of the spectrum made a greater difference in terms of learning than that end of the spectrum. Now, that wasn't scientifically proven. We didn't undertake anything that you would be able to say was statistically significant, but all of the evidence, the accumulation of evidence seemed to suggest that when the students had the device all of the time as a personal device, the amount of learning increased, their commitment to learning increased, and various other learning benefits, which I'll talk about in a moment, which stem from that, were linked to the fact that it was their personal device. And for me, I guess that's a pretty obvious finding, but it's the most important one that we've come across. In terms of methodology, I won't say very much. It was a qualitative piece of research. We undertook surveys at the start and the end. We surveyed the parents. We surveyed the students. We didn't survey the teachers because there weren't as many teachers there. We interviewed all the teachers. We interviewed the head teachers as well. We interviewed the local authorities. Our research questions were essentially about what does learning look like when everybody has a personal device. And then we broke that down into questions, for example, such as what's the issues around parent engagement? Do parents actually see this as a tool for learning? Do they become more engaged in the process of learning themselves? School leaders, there was an issue about leadership. What are the leadership issues? Professional development, a question on what do we look at in terms of professional development and learning? And does that fit a traditional model? And then, of course, the core of it, teaching and learning. What does teaching and learning look like? So what I'm just going to cover now, I haven't got time to do everything. I'll just look at the first 2 very briefly and then stop and give us a chance to discuss this more openly. So teaching and learning and parental engagement, which we found particularly interesting. In terms of teaching and learning, just an obvious statement, but most of the students had access to a device, 81% in fact, had access to a device all the time that they could use at any point. In terms of daily use of technology in school, it increased dramatically. This was a really important feature for the school leaders, ICT coordinators. Before the project had started, it was estimated that use of technology in school, 10% of the time. People were using technology 10% of the time in terms of learning. That increased to 80% of the time. And from the second slide, you can probably see that the significant shift there is towards having technology when you need it, what we might call just-in-time technology rather than just in case. So actually it wasn't used in every lesson. Students, this data comes from student reporting, by the way. It wasn't used in every lesson, but it was used in most lessons. Technology made a significant difference because it was in the classroom in most lessons. And that was a significant shift from where those students had been previously, when they only used technology occasionally. So the question is, if it's there all the time, and you can use it in most lessons, what difference does it make in those lessons? We did some work on, I'm not sure you can see that too clearly, can you see? We did a little bit of work trying to find out what they actually used it for. And of course, as you might gather, apps were very, very popular. I'll come back to apps in a moment. The other 2 things, research and writing. Now, that was rather surprising because the research was conducted with 5 primary schools and 3 secondary schools. And we'd imagined that the creative use of the apps the creative type of things, making movies, making books, would have been higher. And you can see actually they're lower. But what we did find, when we actually separated this out by secondary and primary, is that there was a significant difference between how they were being used across phases. In secondary schools, they were used for those things, writing and research. That was the more prevalent pattern. In primary schools, they were used for more creative work. But the real unknown is using apps, because apps could be anything. Apps could be research. Apps could be a whole plethora of different activities. And in the report, we go into some detail as to what kind of apps people used and what they used them for. But one of the patterns that we discovered there was that as teachers became familiar with the iPad, they moved away from using what we might call skill and drill apps or rote learning apps. Are you familiar with that term? Things really where you can give it to a student, they do something. Maths is a good example. Fractions. It's more or less self-taught. It produces the answer. That was very popular in the early phases of the deployments. But as they became more familiar with the technology, they became more open in terms of how it was used and moved away from those apps to the more generic apps. Things like iMovie. And then used iMovie across a range of different subjects for a range of different purposes. And I think that's quite an important pointer in terms of new schools coming on board, helping teachers to become familiar, whether or not they need to spend quite as long going through some of those rote-type learning apps, and how we can encourage them to look at some of the more creative and open-ended. They're not subject-specific. Many of those apps, of course, will work in any subject. And one of the things I was talking to the head teacher here earlier about how teachers talk so much about apps, and how the conversation around apps seems to elevate classroom discussion, staff room discussion, onto a rather higher level, really, where they're discussing pedagogy and they're relating it back to the technology, rather than just discussing technology. I'll move on. Parental engagement was the other thing that we found really increased when students had the device all the time. Parents reported that before they had the iPad, they saw some technology use in the home, but not that much. When children had the iPad and brought the device home, that increased dramatically, 75% almost. And more importantly, they reported how often their own children seemed to complete homework. Work which had been set by school, which you can see at the end, 77%, but even more interesting, work which hadn't been set by school, work which students just did because they were interested in doing it. And one of the head teachers talked to me about this as being seamless learning. He felt what the iPad did was it broke down the barriers between school and home, because often certainly in the UK context, students will be doing work but they can't take it home, or they don't necessarily take it home. But of course, the iPad, if it's personal, travels with the student. So they'll start a project, and they feel inclined to complete it, or to continue it at home. So we talked a lot in the report about traditional conceptions of homework. And again, in the UK context, homework has become a term which is starting to really concern schools. They're beginning to wonder whether the actual terminology puts students off, and whether this shouldn't be seen as something like extension work or enrichment work. So quite a lot of discussion there about what we mean by homework and whether it's still an appropriate terminology. That just reinforced that. Parents thinking at least that students were more willing to complete homework with their iPad. So the last part is just so what? What difference does all this mean? We made quite a bold statement there, and I stand by it, but it is a bold statement that teaching and learning is fundamentally altered. What the teachers talked to us, and we interviewed a lot of teachers, we watched lessons, we talked to the students as well. Teachers talked about how their pedagogical patterns were changing. One of the things they mentioned was the fact that they taught less. They did less of what I'm doing now. But they actually claimed that they thought more. They actually did more planning. The device required more time in terms of planning, thinking of activities that would engage the students in an interesting and worthwhile fashion, going back to my original point. but less of this kind of didactic approach, certainly more of a facilitator. And that term is bandied around. We talk about teachers becoming facilitators, but I think certainly in the data we collected, we began to really see that. And teachers definitely felt that somehow they were shifting their conception of what teaching was, away from this formal notion towards a more of a facilitative notion. And just in case, that's rather a long quotation, but I put it there because there was a concern that if you give students a personal device, they'll do nothing else but be hooked to the personal device. They'll become individuals who don't talk with anybody else and don't do anything else. And again, maybe it's counterintuitive, but the evidence didn't support that. This teacher clearly talks about students being very selective about how they use the device. And our observations pick that up as well. Quite often students would pick the device up to do one task and pick up a pencil or a piece of paper to do another task. So it wasn't the fact that the device made them, if you like, technology nerds or geeks. The other thing that came out very strongly was the element of collaboration. The way in which the technology actually supported more collaborative patterns. And again, this was slightly counterintuitive, because some of the teachers were very concerned that if every child had a device, they would just be looking at the device. But I visited a number of classrooms where one child would be working around a device and 3 or 4 would actually be collaborating in a conversation. There was a higher level of conversation taking place. And we put up the Apple TV there as an example of a collaborative tool, and I can see you've got one here, so I guess you're using that. That's been a real game changer for the schools who have actually implemented that technology. And primarily, as this teacher is saying here, because it allows students to actually take control of this sacred space which is often the teachers. And in many of the schools, they've actually taken their interactive whiteboards out. I notice you haven't got one, but interactive whiteboards have been a dominant technology in most UK schools since about 2002. But actually schools talking about how they would take it out. Partly because it's not necessary. If you've got an Apple TV, you can do everything that you could do, well, most of the things you could do with an interactive whiteboard. But more importantly, because they felt the whiteboard kind of tethered the teacher. It drew the teacher to the front of the class, and it took away the contribution of students. Now, I think the next game changer will be when Apple, or somebody else, invents peer-to-peer sharing. Because at the moment, the sharing still has to come through that device. So it's still controlled to some extent through a central port. But if we could actually share across devices, and I've seen somebody playing around with that idea, developing an app at the moment, whereby one group can share their findings with another. So if it's a science experiment, you're doing a particular element of that, and you want to share your findings with this group, and we can do it instantly. Now, to me, that really does change the dynamics of the classroom. And the classroom has gone from a model which is very hierarchical, with the teacher at the front, to one which is very much a network. If you think of it, it's very much like Siemens' idea of connectivism, a network where students are actually the nodes, and the nodes of knowledge creation. The other thing that struck us, there was a lot about student confidence. I'm sure you found that as well. Student confidence, teachers reported it, parents reported it, students themselves reported it. They were more confident in every sense, but particularly in terms of showing their work and in terms of sharing their work. I think part of that is because the work is of a higher quality. It looks more professional, but also perhaps there's something about the actual ability to do what we're doing here. This was an important point as well. When I talked about classroom dynamics changing, the other element, apart from collaboration, was the recognition by some of the teachers that the students were now very much in the driving seat. authentic because they felt there was a genuine audience there to look at their work, to read their work, or to view their work, and to give. We did this really just to find out how students believe themselves. The students reported about their own attitudes. You can see it's overwhelmingly positive. And perhaps you might argue that's novelty. In some of these cases, they'd only had the device for 6 months. Teachers actually argued that this wasn't novelty. Many of these students had been using the device. The novelty value, it seemed to them, had already worn off, and therefore, they were still very positive. But the key thing we found is the bottom one, which is interesting, that all the rest overwhelmingly positive, but the students were still concerned that they didn't have access to the device as much as they would like. Now that's really interesting because although I said it was personal and they had as much use of it in theory as they wanted, clearly teachers didn't operate quite as liberally as maybe we'd been led to believe. Because certainly from the perspective of students, they would like to have used it more. There were clearly times when teachers said, put it away, put it down. So that's an issue. The other one, which I think is really interesting, and we need more research on this, it's a classic statement from an academic, isn't it? But it really is something we need to look at, are those two. If they learn more, and especially if it helps them to understand difficult ideas, how does that happen? What's the process? What are the mechanics that help a child, a student, to understand a difficult concept? Now, we didn't have time to actually unpick that. It's what we're looking at doing next. We actually want to focus on specific aspects, what we might call threshold concepts, concepts that are absolutely key to a subject understanding, and try to find out where the iPad or where the personal device has a role to play. There's one example I will show you, and I can see, I'm going to skip through some of this. These are issues for leadership, which we, and I think that just reinforces the issue about personal devices. That was one of the senior leaders in one of the schools who felt it was about the personal ownership. They changed their patterns from using them as class sets, moving towards personal ownership. That's where they saw the real gains. But the example I wanted to show you, and I'll come back to those if you wanted. This was just a model really looking at how knowledge is created and where the iPad has a role to play in that. We'll come back to this in time, but I did want to show you one example. This is the framework we talked about at the start, and we actually broke the framework down because personalisation, in fact, it was more than just one thing. Personalisation was about agency, which means how much control do you give students, to what extent do you let students decide the course of their learning. Customisation. Authenticity was about contextualisation, which is about how realistic are the tasks. Can we actually move towards more realistic tasks, less contrived tasks? And situated is where the learning takes place. Does it really take place in the real world, or is it very much in a practice field, which is the classroom? And then collaboration. Conversation is about, obviously, supporting conversation and data transfer. But the example I'm going to come back to is this one. Now, I noticed on your leaflet here that you've got the app Explain Everything, which I guess you must be using. We singled that out as an example of an app which it seemed to us had real pedagogical value because it could actually address issues that teachers and schools and students need to understand and need to actually perhaps develop better. And that is assessment for learning. And this teacher here is talking about how she's using Screenshot. Has anybody come across? Yeah, it's a similar thing to Explain Everything. And what's really interesting in this case was she'd actually started to use Screenshot to give feedback to students on their work. And then realised that it was even more effective if the students used it themselves to peer assess their own work, to do their own assessment, and then to give it to somebody else and ask them to share and to assess their work. And Explain Everything does the same thing. This is an example of a teacher. I'm sure we can hear that. Sorry, she's very quiet.
I'm going to put the right event and see if we can put it into the past tense. You also don't need the S on the end of the word put. And remember to put a full stop at the end. Other than that, well done.
So just a simple example of a teacher giving formative feedback on a piece of work. The child can see it, the child can hear it, and most importantly, they can go back to it. What we found was the ability to rewind and go back actually was very powerful in terms of them taking notice, rather than a simple written comment. Now I think that has enormous potential in terms of addressing the issue I started with, which was if learning is improved, if students think they're learning more, or they think it's helping them with difficult concepts, what is the process? How does it actually happen? And I think that's where we need to move to in terms of the next level, the next stage of development. Schools across Scotland are now looking at this kind of technology, very interested in adopting it. But the real question they're asking at ministerial level is, what difference will it make? And can you actually track that difference? Can you explain what the processes are that make that difference happen? And I have to say at the moment, I still think we're at the start of that journey. We can give some indicators, but we haven't actually done that kind of detailed research, almost down to the level of tracking hand and eye coordination. You know, for example, what is it about that device, which is very tactile, it's very much manipulated by the hand rather than a mouse. What is it that makes that such an attractive learning device for students, and in what contexts? So I think that's probably enough for me at the moment, and I can go back if anybody wants to look at any of those other issues. I'll explain those more. But if that gives you an idea, a very quick summary of what we've been doing and where the research has taken us so far, I hope that's been useful.
Thanks very much, Kevin. That's great. I might start with Damien, because I know he's got some questions and he might be able to give a bit of context about, or Peter.
Yeah, I just was interested reading the report. You mentioned about the personal development of the staff and the way that the individual schools took a different approach to the training of staff with it. Could you elaborate on how the staff were actually selected to participate for the individual schools? Were they selected because they were familiar with it, therefore they didn't need the PD, the personal development? And also you mentioned about that every PD needs to be done in an authentic context with the schools. Was that a school-based approach, or all the schools that are involved in it, were all the teachers taken out and showing how to use it, for example?
Well, in terms of the first question, which is about how they were selected, it's quite interesting because in many traditional pilots, innovations, it tends to be the early adopters. It tends to be teachers who are already up for this, as we would say, innovators. And that wasn't entirely the case here. Some of the schools did select those teachers. One particular primary school in Edinburgh, a school called Sheens, clearly they had 3 teachers who would use technology very effectively and therefore were at quite a high level of technological literacy. But there were at least 4 schools I visited where people openly said, I'm something of a technophobe really, and this has been really interesting because I'm not a technology person. And I think that was very interesting, that there was a mixture across the schools. We weren't looking just at early adopters. And that in itself tells us something, that teachers who previously considered themselves to be quite technologically, at best agnostic, in some cases quite hostile, didn't seem to have the same issue. So that's the first point. The teachers were chosen from a diverse range. I think if I was being honest, and we didn't actually ask this question, but I guess they were selected because they were good teachers. They understand pedagogy well, not because they were good technologists. The second question about professional development, how it happened, almost 100%, I would say this is the case. It didn't happen in a traditional pattern. Traditionally, for teachers in the UK, this kind of technology would be done as a training program, taking teachers out of the classroom, often coming to a course, they'd be shown how to use the technology, and then expected to implement that and take it back into the class. We didn't have any of that. There was a minor element, there was a launch day where the devices were given out. But the rest of the learning, the professional development, took place in other ways. And it varied according to the schools. So some of the schools, and I think this was a very important lesson, some of the schools paired the teachers up. and they deliberately made sure that 2 teachers, or even more, were working side by side, even to the extent of lesson planning. So they were actually planning lessons together and looking at how the iPad played into that. And there was a constant dialogue between the 2 teachers, and obviously there was learning going on all the time. But they also, in those cases where there was, if you like, a learning community within the school, there were channels to make sure it was shared with a wider audience. So staff meetings, for example, where everybody would actually take their iPad and share an app. Do you have teach meets here? Do you think they're called teach meets? Yeah. So they organised school-based teach meets, and they were all to do with an app. Everybody had to explain an app and illustrate how they'd used it. And that was we judged that to be a very powerful way of professional learning. The other element of learning seemed to be completely uncoordinated and unplanned, and we talked about it as being experiential learning. And that seemed to be a really important factor as well, that every teacher we talked to had an iPad before they used it in a classroom. Some of them had it at least 3 months before. But when we talked about how did you learn to use it, what was the process, a common factor that came up almost every time, I think, was they took it home and they used it with their own children. And it was often play, actually playing with their own children, explaining to them the basics. That seemed to break the barrier and get them onto the first ladder of using the device. Obviously other things had to happen afterwards, but that's quite an interesting model really, teachers giving up their own time to learn with their own children.
If I could just make one comment, I think our journey here at St Agnes has been going on for about 12 months really. But just picking up on the comment about experiential learning, that was something we did for the first 6 months before letting them out into the classroom, so that teachers could get confidence, experiment, and just walk the walk with them, so that they felt very positive. The other thing that was important was to allocate time. That's what we found. Our staff meetings were allocated to using the iPads, people sharing ideas, and I think for us it was important that we had someone drive the whole program and provide extra assistance, and that's Damien, but extra help. And we had a situation where, because of industrial requirements within the teaching profession here, there's a certain number of hours that teachers are expected to attend meetings for. We had that double because we offered extra courses and people just elected to go, and that was out of their own interest. So that was a very positive thing. So yeah, that experiential experience is quite important.
And time as well. And the lead teacher, each of the schools had a lead teacher. I should have said that really. But I guess that is really an important element. Somebody they can go to.
That's right.
Ask advice, share ideas.
I'm really interested in your the surveys that you did, the baseline and the exit surveys. With the parent surveys, because we surveyed our kids, but we have very informal and formal chats with our parents, but we haven't surveyed them as of yet. Your numbers for some of your schools with the parent surveys are quite different to those that participated in the baseline and the exit surveys. Is there one key factor that pinpoints the reason why?
Why? I think really the time factor was the major reason. In Scotland, the schools finish in June, and normally out in England we finish in July. And we set the baseline survey probably a little bit too late in the academic year, thinking that schools were going to finish in July. Yeah. And the schools did their very best to get parental engagement, but it wasn't anywhere near as much as we'd had at the start, when parents are actually there. At the start as well, many of the parents came into school to sign a user agreement with their children. They actually brought them in, they had to sign an agreement about taking the device home. So in a sense, they were a captive audience. But we found generally trying to get parental engagement is tricky, and all the schools have expressed the same issue, trying to get the parents to do the survey. The survey is electronic. If you want it, I can give you it's openly available. But maybe it would be better on paper. We were trying to walk the walk really and demonstrate what it was like. One thing we are looking at, if you're interested in surveys, there is an app called iSurvey, which is available from New Zealand, I think, And we've talked to the company because the way it deploys is it will deploy on the device without internet. So if students take it home and they haven't got internet, they can still do the survey, or rather the parents can. And as soon as they get back into the school, if it's got internet, it just downloads the results. So that's probably a better way, because the survey we did was a web-based survey.
Just interested to ask whether or not the feedback from schools would identify that students could access their learning better, and more specifically about some of the students with additional needs. Was there feedback from the schools about how positive or any gains in their actual learning at the early stage?
Not specifically. We didn't specifically target any kind of demographics of students. I mean, there was the usual, well, not usual, but there was a general feeling that boys in particular were more prepared to express themselves, to commit themselves to work, because it gave them multiple ways of expressing themselves rather than simply text. They were more prepared to give audio feedback, that kind of thing. So there wasn't any other specific groups that we actually focused on in that sense, other than the gender issue, really.
Everything that I read about iPad's successful one-to-one situation is that if the device can go home, there's greater consolidation of learning, more opportunity, etc. And we're deploying in a one-to-one situation next year, but I'm wondering how we sort of navigate through that issue. How can we send the device home and secure the device? I mean, the relationship with the home and the school and who pays for damage and that. I can see that it's a really important thing to do, but we're struggling with how we're going to actually get that up. If we, the school, own the devices, have you sort of come across any approaches that are innovative in the way you deal with that?
I'm not sure how far this actually transfers into different contexts. In the UK, we have something called the e-learning foundation. And the e-learning foundation is designed to help schools and help individuals to purchase technology, not just iPads, but any kind of technology. They're particularly popular in areas where challenging economic circumstances and so on, where parents might struggle to actually be able to buy it themselves. So they operate a leasing scheme. And many of the schools, not in Scotland, I should say Scotland has a particular issue about purchasing educational equipment, full stop. The view is it shouldn't be, you shouldn't have to buy any educational equipment, it should be a state thing. But in England, leasing has been quite popular. And leasing comes with all those other things, insurance, protection, all the rest of it. So that seems to wrap around, and schools, many schools have used that approach. Is that what you've done here? How do you?
We have a parent-funded program where the parents have to purchase the device themselves, so they own it with it. There's only about now, after about 5 months running with the Year 8 cohort, there's only 5 students that use a school device and they can't take it home. So they send their work via Dropbox or email or Moodle account. So they can still work on it at home because all of them still have a PC at home with it. In regards to that relationship between home and school, a really good user agreement with the device is a must. Because the parents own the device, a lot of our parents have said that they'd like, and there's a few phone calls that I've got, can we use it for like banking at home, can my husband use it for work and things like that. Of course they can use it with it. We've had some breakages with screens outside of school, and that comes back to the parents to make sure that they had the insurance we recommended through our partner Mac One, either the Mac One insurance or that they look at the home and contents cover at home. I don't know how that would transfer if the school owned the device, but that's one way that we kind of got around it. Definitely that the parents own the device and would cover the cost if there was any breakages.
Interesting. Because actually that's slightly different. In the UK, the leasing schemes I just mentioned, the school owns the device. Even though the parents make a contribution, it's not the whole cost, it's a contribution. So the device is technically the school's, and that was an issue because schools felt lots of things about how it might be used. That's interesting.
When you say school owning the device, I completely understand school owning the iPad, but iTunes accounts, the apps, students.
What tends to happen there is the school have one account, so they put a set of standard apps that they might want students to have. Students can put another account on, so if they want to buy their own apps, they can, but it's on a different iTunes account.
Can I just say something? I think when we're looking at rolling out a program, one of the groups that we often forget about is our parents, because our parents have a certain view of how they were educated, and it's all different now.
That's right.
And what we're going to move forward next week, is it, or a week after, we're just going to run a normal lesson with iPads, but the parents will be the students, because we want to show them how learning has changed and teaching has changed, and what your son or daughter is talking about when they come home to talk about their day at school. So it's really important to get that message across to them, and then that relationship between the student, the parents and the school is a priority, and they'll make sure that the kids bring the iPads to school each day and all that sort of thing. So it's just a comment.
I think it's a game changer in terms of we put a full section in the report about parental engagement, and it seems to be something about the device. For example, parents say we were more likely to look at work when it was on the device than traditional. We were more likely to talk to children about work and to actually do some work with them. So there is something about the device, and certainly in the context of Scotland, where there are a lot of local services, a lot of local authority services, which they find quite difficult to get to certain parents. They're seeing the iPad as being the gateway to that. A good example is library services. In Edinburgh, the library services have gone entirely digital. So you can actually order a book, any of their books, through the iPad. And that's had an enormous impact on parental engagement in reading, and particular groups where literacy, adult literacy has been an issue. They've actually found the iPad is working as a kind of Trojan horse to access that. So I think there's a lot more to be gained by working closely with parents. I'm probably only tipping the iceberg at the moment. As to what
I would say, as a principal here, I have seen more student work than I've ever seen before, because kids will come up and show you. And other staff members have been interviewed more often than ever, filmed, and that becomes part of their presentation and all that sort of thing. That's their data gathering and that. So it's a really good device, and I think if you're walking around outside any time here, I'll come to you for an opinion about something. What do you think about this, and can we film you and all that sort of thing? So as teaching and really good skills.
Do you have ubiquitous wireless across the site?
Yes. Yep.
So that's very important, isn't it? Well, I didn't mention that, but it's really important to have wireless, because a lot of what it does depends on that. And a lot of schools we talk to actually begin to think about how they could extend the wireless even wider area networks. In the UK, we've toyed with the idea of wide area networks. One or two places like Telford, actually, which is a medium-sized town, they developed a network across the whole town. But we haven't got there yet, and to me that's crucial, because these are great until they go out of wireless range. And then a lot of the valuable services, GPS particularly, doesn't work. So how we can bridge that gap between the home often, where wireless might exist, and the school, I think will be an important consideration in the future.
Just going back to what you were asking before about kids with diverse learning needs, with that app, Explain Everything, a few of our assessment tasks, the very traditional way was kids would just write, not essay style, but just answering questions with it. But with Explain Everything using the iPad, kids are able to speak into it or record their actions on the screen. So that takes the pressure and the embarrassment off them from gaining access to it. Our literacy coordinator works with a Sudanese girl in Year 7, and since the beginning of the year she's been using the iPad just for that rote learning of the skills of the spelling to get into it. She has it in front of the class, records what her connected learning teacher is saying, and then listens back to it afterwards in case she forgot it or just zoned out with it.
There's tremendous value, I think, around apps like that for assessment, formative assessment. It's one of the areas where a number of projects in England, we're talking to schools about taking that a stage further. Because the other thing I think something like Explain Everything does, it makes It makes students' thinking more transparent. Because if you ask them to actually explain not just what the answer is, but how did they reach the answer, and you actually see that, you can hear them articulating it, and that's more valuable usually than the answer. Mathematicians will do that anyway, but other subjects, explain something there, show me how you got there. It's really valuable feedback.
We visited Neutral Bay Public School, and they've had a rollout of iPads in their Year 6, and one of the comments from one of the teachers was the kids are accountable 100% of the day because they're likely to be recorded or involved in conversation far more than they were.
Well, I know that was very quick, and thanks for your questions. We will have to move on so that Damien got organised for us to see our classroom.
Yep.
So can I just thank Kevin and thank Chris for coming as well.